He vanished, chasing a truth no one wanted uncovered, and for 8 years, the system kept that secret buried in concrete. But when a worker cracked open the casino floor, the voice they tried to silence came back with a warning. They're already inside. Before we dig deeper into the disturbing truth behind Agent Lowell's disappearance, make sure you've liked the video and subscribed to our channel so you don't miss what we uncover next. We're working to bring hidden stories like this back into the light, and reaching 1,000 subscribers keeps this investigation going. It's a small click for you, but it means everything to us. Thank you. It started on a morning like any other, dust rising in the Nevada heat. Jackhammers rattling, concrete splitting open like old skin. The construction crew had been tearing into the old foundation of what was once a condemned hotel, now being gutted to make room for a high-rise casino. Most of them didn't expect to find anything more interesting than rebar and rodent bones. But as the backhoe dug deep into a corner of the foundation, something caught the operator's eye. Metal. Too clean for scrap, too deliberate for trash. They stopped the machine. Within minutes, the crew had surrounded the unearthed shape, half buried in cement and soil. A sealed steel lockbox, pitted from years of exposure but intact, untouched. Heavy, intentional. It took crowbars and gloved hands to pry it free. No one said much. One of the younger guys joked that maybe it was cash. Someone else muttered, or a body. When they cracked it open, they found neither. No bills, no bones, just silence, and then the glint of something unmistakably official. Inside, wrapped in decayed cloth, was a federal badge dulled by time but still legible. Beneath it, a rusted firearm, the serial number barely readable, its grip cracked from years underground. And finally, a name tag faded, stained, but still holding on. 3 letters punched into the metal like a final whisper. A. Lowell. The crew didn't touch anything after that. No one moved. Someone backed away and made the call to local law enforcement. Within the hour, the site was sealed off. Yellow tape, suits, photographers. The box was taken away, but the damage was already done. Whispers began moving faster than paperwork. Someone said FBI. Another said murder. Another said, "Didn't a guy disappear from the Bureau back in the 90s? The name brought it all back. For some, a vague memory, news clips, grainy photos, a case that went nowhere. For others, something sharper. The agent who vanished during an investigation into mob-connected casino financing. The man who left his office and never returned. His disappearance hadn't been headline news for long, these things rarely are. But inside the Bureau, it had festered like an open wound. He'd been close to something, they'd said, or too far out on his own. Some claimed he ran. Others suspected he was silenced. His body was never found. His case file, after 8 years of nothing, had been quietly moved to inactive status. Just another unsolved chapter in a town that specializes in burying secrets. Now, it wasn't unsolved anymore. Now, his name had surfaced literally from beneath the bones of a building meant to hide him. The discovery didn't just stir up dust. It rattled ghosts. Because Alan Lowell wasn't just another agent. He'd been chasing something big. And whatever it was, it had been dangerous enough to erase him. But things buried don't always stay buried. The lockbox was only the beginning. The real story, the one he died trying to tell, was waiting to be dug out of years of silence, cement, and blood. The rain had started just after sunset. Slow at first. Then steady, slicking the streets of Las Vegas in a sheen of oil and reflection. That Thursday evening, Special Agent Alan Lowell was the last man in the FBI's local field office. The others had gone home hours before. He stayed behind under the harsh glow of overhead fluorescence, sifting through files that never made it into the system. Names not in databases. ledgers not entered into evidence. A quiet war waged in silence and margins. He'd been different that week, more withdrawn, more deliberate. He hadn't said why, but a few agents noticed it in the way he walked, in the way he double-checked locked doors that had already been sealed. Something was weighing on him, something he hadn't told anyone. At 9:46 p.m., Lowell logged out. Security footage shows him walking through the lobby in a raincoat, briefcase in hand, head down. He doesn't speak to the guard. He doesn't look back. That was the last confirmed sighting of him alive. The following morning, he didn't show up for work. At first, no one panicked. He was known to work off-site, sometimes vanishing for a day or two without notice when following a lead. But by midday, there were calls. By nightfall, the worry turned to dread. His wife hadn't heard from him. His cell was off. His pager silent. The official report was filed 27 hours after he'd last been seen. 2 days later, they found his car, a bureau-issued sedan, abandoned on a desolate desert road east of the city. The keys were still in the ignition. Driver's side door ajar. No signs of struggle. No footprints. No blood. Just a lonely vehicle, slowly filling with dust. Inside the trunk was a single file folder, empty, nothing else. Not his badge, not his sidearm, not the briefcase he'd been carrying. The area was combed by search teams, helicopters, dogs. Nothing turned up. The desert swallowed whatever story it had been asked to hold. Speculation spread like wildfire, both inside and outside the bureau. Some thought he'd gone rogue, walked away, staged the scene. Others suspected a hit. The timing was too precise. Lowell had been deep into a case involving multiple casino owners with rumored ties to organized crime. He was tracing financial conduits, shell companies, and offshore accounts linked to illegal gaming revenue. The kind of work that didn't make headlines but made enemies. The operation had been running quietly for months, but Lowell had begun to press further than others were willing to go. He didn't trust paper trails. He trusted patterns, instinct, and fear. And lately, he had plenty of the last one. A few believed he'd uncovered something he wasn't supposed to see, something bigger than mob money or crooked developers, something that reached past Vegas, into the upper tiers of protection and silence. One anonymous source within the Bureau said Lowell had requested classified files 2 days before he vanished, files he never received, requests that were later scrubbed. The official story faded quickly. No leads, no suspects, just absence. After 6 months, the task force was disbanded. After 2 years, his wife moved out of state. After 5 years, the Bureau listed him as presumed dead. But for those who knew him really knew him, there was no peace in the silence. Lowell hadn't run. He hadn't broken. He had simply vanished, like a breath exhaled into the desert wind. In the first week, they called it urgent. Agents were pulled from other assignments. Flyers were printed. Surveillance tapes reviewed. Informants squeezed. Every hour mattered. Every scrap of possible evidence was treated like a fuse waiting to be lit. But the hours kept passing, and nothing caught fire. Special Agent Alan Lowell had disappeared without a whisper, leaving behind only questions and an empty car on a lonely stretch of desert highway. The Bureau set up a task force. Command centers were assembled, maps pinned with string, databases combed. They knocked on doors from Henderson to Barstow, followed leads that twisted into dead ends. Every day began with resolve and ended with silence. At the center of it all was his wife, Emily. She stood in front of television cameras, her voice steady but her eyes hollow, repeating his name like a prayer she refused to abandon. She believed he'd come back. She said it with conviction. Alan wouldn't just walk away. Something happened to him. Behind the cameras, agents exchanged looks they didn't want to name, because there was no evidence, no ransom call, no threats, no blood. just a man who had vanished in the middle of an investigation tied to the mob, and a growing sense that no one really wanted to find out why. Inside the bureau, the story began to fracture. Some believed he'd been killed, silenced by the very people he was chasing. Others whispered darker things. That maybe he hadn't vanished at all. That maybe he'd staged it. That maybe the badge found in his car was a breadcrumb, not a clue. A way to control the story. The kind of agent who worked alone, trusted few, and dug deep, was also the kind of agent who might go off book. But even the defection theory felt hollow. Lowell had a reputation, not for bending, but for breaking things open. He was methodical, obsessive, but he wasn't reckless, and he wasn't dirty. Months passed. The task force shrank. New cases came in. Old ones demanded attention. The world moved on, but not everyone inside those concrete walls forgot. A few agents, quiet ones. The kind who remembered details others overlooked, kept files in drawers they didn't label. They didn't talk about Lowell openly. But when new cases touched old names, when fresh intel echoed long-buried leads, they took notes. There were patterns in the silence. One such agent, a quiet analyst named Rourke, once told a colleague over coffee, "You don't bury a man that deep unless you're afraid of what he left behind." The Bureau never made a public statement beyond the basic facts. Internally, Lowell was labeled missing, presumed dead. The file was marked inactive 2 years to the day after he disappeared. By then, his home had been sold, his desk reassigned, and his name rarely spoken. But underneath the stillness, the questions lived on. Why had he been working nights alone? Why had he filed requests for sealed records days before he vanished? And who signed off on closing the case with so many threads left dangling? The story went quiet. But quiet isn't the same as forgotten. It lingers, waiting. Because even in a place like Las Vegas, where erasure is an art form, some things refuse to stay buried. Long before his disappearance, before the badge and the headlines, Alan Lowell understood that organized crime in Las Vegas wasn't just a collection of violent men moving money under the table. It was a system one built on architecture, on permits, on concrete, signatures, and silence. He said it once, over coffee in the Bureau's break room, not knowing someone would remember. You don't find the rot in the streets. You find it in the blueprints. Most agents looked at the syndicate through wiretaps and witness statements. Lowell went through zoning records, shadow LLCs, and building code exemptions pushed through City Hall at midnight. He wasn't chasing capos or foot soldiers. He was tracing roots, deep ones, the kind that twisted under entire blocks and came up inside boardrooms. Officially, he was assigned to a multi-year task force targeting illegal laundering operations tied to legacy mob families. But sometime in mid-1997, something changed. His paperwork became sparse. He stopped logging field visits. Colleagues noticed how often he worked alone, how he avoided briefings, how he deflected questions with vague responses like, "I'm still pulling threads." He was still working the mob, but not the part anyone else could see. He'd started building a map, one that didn't point to any one person, but to an entire ecosystem. Developers whose fortunes tripled overnight. Land bought and sold through 6 companies, each vanishing after the deal closed. Inspectors who signed off on safety clearances without ever visiting the site. Political donations from empty offices. He was seeing something. Something no one else had the stomach or clearance to admit. He'd found a pattern between old construction permits issued in the late 1982 and the resurgence of certain casinos under new ownership. The same names kept popping up, buried under layers of paperwork. Connected by P.O. boxes in other states. all converging on a single idea: that the city hadn't just been infiltrated, it had been built that way. The mob wasn't hiding from oversight. It was embedded in the oversight itself. When Lowell began pulling sealed court filings, records tied to federal cases, long considered dormant, red flags went up. Internally, there were quiet inquiries. Why was he accessing documents outside his case parameters? Who had authorized the clearance extensions? But by then, he wasn't asking for permission. He'd stopped trusting the process. There were whispers that he'd spoken to someone on the inside. A developer turned informant who'd hinted at a deal struck decades ago. City contracts traded for silence. Casino floor plans designed to facilitate skimming. Judges who owed their appointments to the very men they were meant to rule against. Lowell never wrote this down. But in the margins of one of his folders, someone later found a note. It was never about hiding bodies. It was about hiding architecture. He began locking his files in a private safe, keeping handwritten notes instead of digital logs. When pressed, he claimed it was to reduce exposure. But it was clear he no longer trusted the Bureau entirely. The deeper he dug, the more isolated he became. And in those final weeks before he vanished, some recall that he looked over his shoulder more than once. Paranoid? Maybe. But in a city where concrete remembers more than people do, maybe he had reason. Maybe Lowell had stumbled not into a criminal conspiracy, but into the infrastructure of one. And maybe the only way to stop him from exposing it was to make sure his story never got finished. The steel box sat beneath a heavy pane of fluorescent light in a secure evidence lab at the Las Vegas field office. Its latches now pried open, hinges creaking like a whisper from another time. There were no grand pronouncements when the lid lifted, just the quiet rustle of plastic gloves and the sterile stillness of agents holding their breath. Inside, the air was stale and metallic, soaked with the faint scent of rust, age, and something else like damp paper that had waited too long in silence. A stack of photographs lay on top, some stuck together by moisture, others curled at the edges. Grainy shots of casino construction sites from the late 92nd. Close-ups of concrete pylons, blueprints marked with red circles. And faces, some familiar, some not, men in suits exiting buildings, shaking hands under neon signs, never looking at the camera but never quite unaware of it either. Beneath the photographs, layers of folded notes, yellowed and brittle, filled with Lowell's tight, cramped handwriting. Coordinates, names, dates, sentences that read more like warnings than observations. The same contractor signed for 3 buildings. 2 are now gone. 1 buried him. But it was the tape recorder that stopped the room. An old handheld model, scuffed and heavy, the kind that was already outdated when Lowell had vanished. The batteries were long dead, but the magnetic strip was intact. The techs handled it like an artifact, whispering as they set up the transfer equipment. Static greeted them at first, a wash of dead air and faint mechanical groans. Then, halfway through the reel, the crackle sharpened. A voice, faint and worn, broke through like something rising from underwater. If you're hearing this, it means they found me. They're not hardened to. If you're hearing this, the voice was unmistakable. Alan Lowell's price. Even beneath the distortion, it held that same measured cadence, the practiced calm of a man who knew the weight of every word he spoke. The agents didn't speak. The tech didn't breathe. The recording went on, fragmented and wounded, like a confession trying to outrun the clock. "They're closer than you think," Lowell said. "Not just behind the money. Inside it. The names you trust look again. Some of them don't even know who they're working for." More static. Then a pause, as if he'd stopped to collect himself. Knowing there might not be a second take, "I kept records. Not everything. just enough. If it's still there, they didn't find it. Or maybe they did, and buried it deeper. But if you're listening, you're already too close to stop now. The last intelligible sentence landed like a weight against the chest. They won't let it come to light. They'll bury you the same way they buried me. Then, silence. The tape kept spinning, catching only the faint hum of background noise, distant traffic perhaps, or maybe the quiet breathing of a man who had already made peace with the idea he wouldn't be heard in time. The rest of the recording was too damaged to recover. The sealed envelope came next. Alan's handwriting scrawled across the front. Not before everything. Inside, the paper was still sealed, edges lined with adhesive that had yellowed but held firm. Forensics would handle it with care, but the implications were immediate. This wasn't just a message from the past, it was evidence. Buried beneath a casino built on shadows, now unearthed in a city where silence had always been currency. And for the first time in 8 years, Alan Lowell was speaking again. The lot had been dead space for years, an aging brick structure on the north edge of Fremont, forgotten behind newer towers of glass and steel. It was the kind of place you passed without seeing, a building that seemed to shrink further into itself with every summer, its windows long gone, boarded up like eyes refusing to witness. In the late 92nd, locals called it cursed. Not because of what had happened there, but because of what never did. Tenants came and went. Fires broke out without warning. Inspections were skipped. Then, in the spring of 1999, a yellow notice was posted on its rusted front door. Condemned. 6 months later, it was gone. Bulldozed. No ceremony. No headlines. Just leveled ground, waiting to be reborn. That's what they built the casino on. The foundation poured within weeks of demolition, permits approved overnight. Environmental assessments, safety checks, and zoning clearances all passed without resistance. Too fast, said the agents, now retracing that paper trail. The kind of fast that required more than efficiency. The kind that required leverage. Buried inside the city's public records were blueprints stamped with the name of a holding company no one could find anymore. Vesta Group Holdings, LLC. A shell company with no physical address, no employees, and no trace of where its funding originated. It had appeared 3 months before the building was condemned, secured development rights for the lot, filed construction paperwork, and then dissolved quietly 38 days after Alan Lowell's disappearance. No tax records, no filings with the Nevada Secretary of State, just a name, an approval stamp, and a vanishing act. The agents following the trail weren't rookies. They knew how to find fingerprints in ink, where to search for inconsistencies in the folds of bureaucracy. Vesta Group didn't just handle the property transfer, it had filed for an exemption that allowed early groundwork to begin before demolition was complete. A loophole that should have taken months to process was signed off in less than 4 days. The authorizing signature? A now retired city engineer, last seen vacationing abroad weeks after his abrupt resignation in early 2000. And in the archived permits, one line stood out like a crack in the facade. Foundational materials may be retained beneath concrete pour to reduce disposal costs. It was an odd phrase, legal in structure, but vague in intention. To the untrained eye, it was harmless. But to anyone who knew how things were hidden, it was a confession, a silent nod toward something meant to stay buried. Satellite photos from 1998 showed the building still intact that fall. By early 2000, construction had begun on the new casino's skeleton. But in the space between those two images, somewhere in that hollow gap of months, something was planted sealed inside steel, locked in silence. A box with Lowell's voice and his fears. A piece of him left behind when the rest was taken. No one had ever looked into Vesta Group. There had never been a reason until now. And as investigators began digging through old city contracts, subcontractor lists, and notarized statements, a shape began to form. Not a person, not even a company. A network. Paper-thin identities built to vanish on command, all orbiting around one site, one demolition, and one missing federal agent. Las Vegas had always been built on reinvention. Towers rise from the ashes of the forgotten. But some things, no matter how deeply they're buried, echo, especially when the concrete they lie beneath was poured in silence. The initials showed up early in the stack of Lowell's recovered notes, scribbled in the margins, like a whisper meant only for himself. CJ, sometimes underlined. Other times, boxed in red pen, as if he were reminding himself that whoever this was, this name with no name, was important enough not to lose track of. But that's exactly what happened, because when the agents began pulling at the thread, there was nothing left to grip. CJ was everywhere, and nowhere. In a memo buried inside a 1,997 surveillance summary, Lowell had circled the name of a company attorney listed as present at a confidential settlement meeting. Charles J. _________. The last name had been blacked out, redacted before the file had ever been printed. The ink burned deep into the page. In another note, Lowell wrote only, CJ moved east in 2091. Resurfaced 2096. Now behind Vesta? It wasn't conclusive, but it was deliberate. He believed this man, whoever he really was, didn't just drift into development. He'd been placed there, carefully. Digging into court archives unearthed a series of familiar names in unfamiliar places. Mob-connected defendants from New Jersey and Chicago, all represented in the late 82nd and early 92nd by the same legal team. At the bottom of one affidavit, a signature, Charles J. Capra. A clean record, no criminal convictions, but known, at least internally, as a fixer. Not the kind who made calls. The kind who moved money, buried assets, and rewrote ownership through paperwork so sterile it passed every audit. Capra had vanished from legal circles around 1993, just as the DOJ began pushing harder into organized crime's financial infrastructure. No disbarment. No scandal. He just stopped appearing. That would have been the end of the trail. But Lowell, always thorough, had kept a grainy photo clipped behind a folded map. It was dated March 1998, 3 months before he vanished. A man stepping out of a black sedan in front of a construction trailer. Dark suit, gray hair, heavyset, no label, no annotation. But on the back, in Lowell's handwriting, CJ, site visit. The location matched the future grounds of the casino, where the lockbox was later found. Property records didn't list Capra. Neither did the LLC's articles of incorporation. But his signature, or one that matched it, showed up once more, buried in a 1997 contractor agreement, notarized in California and filed late, after the permit had already cleared. Then nothing. No address. No tax return. No mention of him in corporate registries after 1999. It was as if he'd been erased. Lowell never filed an official report naming Capra. No briefing. No mention in team meetings. No formal memo. Just notes. Fragments. The kind of record someone keeps when they don't trust what happens to their reports. The kind of trail you leave when you suspect someone's watching what you file. Now, looking at what remains, one thing is clear. Lowell had found something he wasn't ready to share. Or perhaps something he couldn't. A man who had once moved within the law, then stepped behind it. Vanishing just as concrete was poured and permits stamped. CJ wasn't a ghost. He was a shape moving behind the architecture. and Lowell had been following his footsteps, right to the edge of the map. The photograph had curled at the edges, its surface dulled by time and moisture, but the image it captured still burned with an uneasy clarity. A woman, mid-30s, maybe younger, with dark hair pinned back in soft waves, stood in the blurred background of what looked like a casino lounge. A tray balanced in one hand. Her face turned slightly to the side. Eyes caught mid-glance in a way that suggested she wasn't posing. She hadn't known she was being photographed. That much was clear. The edges of the photo had once held writing identifying marks in pen that had since been torn or cut away. All that remained was the upper stroke of a letter, maybe a J or an L, incomplete and useless. The Bureau's lab confirmed the tear was deliberate. Not time or where. Someone had removed her name. Whether it was Lowell or someone else, no one could say for sure. But she was there, and Lowell had kept her image locked away with his final evidence. That meant something. Tucked beside the photo, in a smaller envelope, was a single page of notes in Lowell's handwriting. Fragmented thoughts. Disconnected lines. Saw her again near Riviera. Says she's scared. Someone followed her home. Tied to Santiago through brother. Disappeared once before 2094. None of it added up to a report. Just pieces. But they painted the outline of someone who wasn't just a witness. She was running from something. Or someone. A deeper search through employment records and internal logs pointed to a handful of cocktail servers who had worked at a lounge inside a now demolished casino. The Crescent Long rumored to be a laundering hub for mob-connected profits during the late 92nd. The Crescent had burned down in 2002. Arson, officially, though no arrests were made. Cross-referencing photo-facial markers and employee headshots from a surviving HR database turned up a tentative match. Her name, at the time, had been Lena Moreau, a stage alias registered with the union. But her real name, if she had ever used it, wasn't listed in any federal database. No social security number, no license. A former Crescent bartender remembered her. Quiet, he said, always watching the room. The kind of girl who knew better than to ask questions, but still looked like she had them. He recalled her leaving suddenly, mid-shift, after being pulled aside by a man in a charcoal suit no one had seen before or since. She never came back. Her locker was cleared out the next day. It wasn't unusual for women in that world to vanish. Some moved on, others moved under. But Lowell's note suggested he'd met her twice. Once formally. The other off-book. He hadn't included her in any official case files. No interview transcript. No tape. And the line in the margin of one of his notes. She knows where the bodies are buried, but not the ones in the ground. That sentence lingered. It didn't read like metaphor. It read like warning. Now, years later, her face had returned. Rising from the bottom of a locked box, buried beneath a foundation poured over lies. Whoever Lena Moreau was, she had mattered. Enough for Lowell to protect her identity. Enough to risk breaking protocol. And maybe enough to die for. The hiss was constant. A low electrical breath that sat beneath the recovered recording like a pulse. Audio engineers worked for days, scrubbing static frame by frame, lifting every whisper buried under layers of magnetic decay. What they uncovered wasn't polished or complete. Lowell's voice came in fragments, staggered phrases. Pauses stretched by fear or fatigue, but it was unmistakably his. Even after all these years, there was a quiet tension in the way he spoke, as if he knew time was already running out. "They've been watching," the voice murmured. Distorted, but clear enough to recognize the wear in his tone. Not just me. The people I talked to. The people who ask too many questions. There was a pause, Maybe the sound of him turning away from the recorder. Maybe just silence falling between thoughts. Then the scrape of a chair. The soft click of a lighter. When he spoke again, the rhythm had changed, like someone rehearsing a confession he wasn't sure would ever be heard. "They know I know." A chill ran through the room when that line was first played back. It was more than paranoia. It was certainty. The kind that doesn't come from suspicion, but from experience. Lowell described the feeling of being followed: cars, parked outside his apartment with tinted windows, calls that went dead as soon as he answered, a man he saw twice in the lobby who never signed in. "You start to feel it in your spine before you see it," he said. That cold, deliberate distance. They're not rushing. They're watching, waiting. In another section of the tape, reconstructed from a damaged stretch of audio, Lowell hinted at an internal leak, someone within the Bureau feeding information to outside interests. He never named names, but he sounded defeated. "I don't know who to trust anymore. The walls aren't solid. Every time I take a step forward, something gets erased." Then, a rustle of paper. The sound of something unfolding, likely the same map found in the box. His voice grew firmer. Determined. "I marked everything. Not here. Not on this tape. But I left it where they won't look. They're watching me, not the paper. That's the mistake." The most chilling passage came toward the end. The static thickened here, like the tape was resisting revelation. But Lowell pushed through. "If I vanish, follow the permits." 6 words. Anchored in quiet dread, and yet it wasn't a cry for help. It was instruction. The voice of a man who knew he wouldn't be able to finish what he started, but hoped someone else might. He trusted the paper trail more than people. He left his breadcrumbs where bureaucracy couldn't lie. The engineers couldn't recover the full recording. Portions remained, lost sections, warped beyond repair. But what remained told a story. Not just of fear, but of strategy. Lowell hadn't gone down blind. He had mapped the maze before they took the light. In the weeks after the tape's analysis, agents began revisiting permit records. Old buildings. Casino expansions. Every approval Lowell had flagged. There, buried beneath routine signatures and city stamps. A pattern began to form. He had left a trail, not loud, not obvious, but deliberate. Like Morse code tapped from behind a wall, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. The answers weren't buried in bodies or back alleys. They were tucked inside filing cabinets and sealed records, in documents passed over too quickly, or approved too quietly. That's where Lowell had looked. And now, finally, someone else was following the trail he'd carved alone in silence. It started with the requests formal, by the book filings made by Lowell in the spring and summer of 1998. He'd submitted more than a dozen access requests to the National Archives, District Court vaults, and the Las Vegas City Records Division. Each one sought information that, on the surface, seemed routine. Land, transfer deeds, development permits, sealed court transcripts from financial fraud cases, zoning amendments. But when mapped together, a pattern emerged. They all revolved around 3 square miles of downtown Las Vegas real estate property that, over the course of a decade, had shifted hands quietly and consistently between entities that barely existed on paper. Casino expansions, construction permits, federal cases that disappeared into closed sessions with no public resolution. Every one of Lowell's requests had been denied. Some cited jurisdiction. Others claimed the files were lost, sealed indefinitely, or misfiled. One was denied because the requesting agent, Lowell himself, did not have appropriate clearance. The irony wasn't lost on anyone now reviewing the denials. He was the agent investigating the case. Yet suddenly, inexplicably, barred from the very documents that defined it. Then came the final blow. Internal logs revealed that Lowell's investigative access credentials, his digital keycard into archived case files and federal records, had been quietly deactivated just 4 days before his disappearance. No alert was sent. No email. The change was buried in an automated system update. The agent who authorized it was a senior supervisor, now retired, who refused to comment when contacted. The timing was too sharp, too surgical, like someone pulling the plug before the lights revealed too much. Agents poring over Lowell's surviving files began to see what he'd been trying to assemble. The land transfer deeds he requested were tied to companies that dissolved within a year of purchase. In one case, a building was sold 3 times in the same month, each sale inflating the value, before the final owner, a Shell LLC, secured a city grant to revitalize underutilized commercial property. That building now housed one of the most profitable casinos in the state. Every paper trail curved back to a central axis. A single corridor of property Lowell had labeled in his notes as the spine. His hand-drawn map placed red marks at both ends, one on the site where his badge and tape recorder would eventually be found. The other, a former municipal storage lot sold in 1990 to an anonymous buyer and now home to a luxury hotel with no listed ownership. It wasn't just about money. It was about structure. Who owned what? How they got it, and what disappeared to make it possible. Lowell had found something systemic, a design hidden inside paperwork so mundane that most would never think to question it. But he had, and someone had noticed. Because those requests, those quiet, methodical filings, were Lowell's signal flare, not loud, not public, but deliberate. He hadn't shouted what he found. He'd written it in forms, signed it in triplicate, and trusted that if anything ever happened to him, someone might read between the lines. Now they were, and the paper was finally starting to speak. He came forward without warning, stepping into the Las Vegas field office like someone wandering into the wrong building. No appointment, no lawyer, just a thin man in his late 70s with a limp and hands that trembled when he signed his name at the front desk. The clerk nearly dismissed him until he muttered a phrase that made her freeze. "I drove the Fed into the desert, back in 2098. That was all it took to send him upstairs, where a pair of senior agents led him into a quiet room with no windows and a flickering fluorescent light. He gave his name as Victor Marinelli, though no one could immediately verify if it was real. He looked like he'd spent the better part of his life in the desert. Leathery skin, sun-stained eyes, a voice like gravel in a paper bag. What he told them came out in pieces. The kind of story that's been buried for so long it forgets how to be whole. Victor said he used to drive for men who didn't like their names, said out loud. Back then, he didn't ask questions. He was paid to deliver, not to understand. But in May of 1998, he was told to pick someone up. They didn't say who, he said. Just gave me a time, a location, and a van. Plain. No plates. The pickup point was a parking garage downtown. He pulled in, cut the lights, waited. At exactly 1:17 a.m., 2 men opened the back doors and shoved someone inside. I never saw his face. He was already blindfolded, tied at the wrists, breathing heavy but not yelling. Victor said one of the men leaned in and said, "You don't talk. You don't ask." He took the van east, out toward the dry lake beds, past the lights, past the asphalt, miles into open desert. He drove in silence, heart hammering, eyes locked on the road that barely existed. When they reached a spot marked by a crooked metal post and an old tire half buried in the dirt, the 2 men told him to stop. They got out. dragged the blindfolded man out behind them. Victor stayed in the van. "I lit a cigarette," he said, his eyes not meeting the agent's. "That's all I did. I didn't want to hear, but I did." There was shouting. Not a lot. Just enough to let him know the man in the blindfold was trying to speak. Pleading, maybe. Then one of the voices snapped back. Loud, final, and then silence. One gunshot, close range. Echo, swallowed by the desert. They came back without the body. Victor said one of the men wiped his hands on a rag and tossed it into the brush. "Drive back. You don't remember this," he was told. "You never saw him. You never saw us." Us. He didn't argue. He drove. And for 27 years, he kept the secret. But time has a way of rotting through silence. And lately, he'd been dreaming about that night. About the shape of the man in the rearview mirror. Blindfolded, silent, and gone. When asked why he came forward now, he didn't hesitate. "I heard about the box. About the badge. I saw the name on the news. Lowell. That was him, wasn't it?" The agents didn't answer. They didn't have to. The old man already knew. Victor didn't ask for protection. Didn't ask for a deal. He only asked one thing before he left the room. Did they ever find him? "No," they said, "not yet." He nodded, then turned to go. No one stopped him. Some truths arrive too late for justice, but not too late to be known. The original blueprints for the casino were locked in a municipal archive, filed under a temporary project name that had never appeared on signage or promotional material. Project Larkspur. It took weeks for agents to track them down, buried under unrelated zoning requests from the early 2002, scanned in low resolution, and misfiled under an outdated contractor license. But when the rolled pages were finally spread across a conference table inside the Bureau's evidence review room, what they revealed stopped the room cold. There it was, a rectangular void, etched clearly beneath the main gaming floor, sitting just below the northeast quadrant of the foundation. No internal access point. No doors. No utilities. A space 40 feet long, 15 feet wide, 8 feet high, sealed entirely in reinforced concrete. No reason. No function. Just a blank space. At first glance, it could have been dismissed as a drafting error. But the blueprint included elevation specs and structural annotations, clear, intentional planning. Someone had designed that space to exist, and more importantly, to remain unreachable. The architect listed on the blueprints was a man named Ray Donovan, retired now, living just outside of Carson City. When two agents visited him unannounced, he was reluctant to talk at first. Old contracts, North Dakota A agreements. Too many memories he'd tried to drink away. But when they showed him the copy of his own drawing, his face changed. Not surprise, but unease. Recognition. "I remember that," he said, tapping the outline of the sealed chamber. "That wasn't mine." He explained that the void had been added late in the process. During the second round of revisions, a consultant brought in by the developer, someone who went by the name James Callan, had insisted on it. Said it was for infrastructure flexibility, whatever that meant. Donovan had argued it made no architectural sense, no airflow, no structural logic, just dead space. But he was pushy, Donovan recalled. Had paperwork, contracts, and signatures. So I folded. When asked if he ever saw Callan again, the old architect shook his head. Number, he was just gone after that. Disappeared before construction even broke ground. The Bureau began pulling records for James Callan. There were none. No license. No employment records. No IRS filings. No birth certificate. The name had appeared on only 2 documents tied to the Larkspur project, a consultant invoice and an engineering amendment. Both were signed and submitted through a third-party legal firm that had since been dissolved. Whoever Callan was, he had inserted himself into the blueprint of a multi-million-dollar development, authorized a sealed space beneath a casino floor, and vanished without leaving a single legal footprint. The room in the blueprint was never mentioned again in any of the construction updates or occupancy permits. There were no inspection reports, no change orders, no documentation of the concrete pour that entombed it. It didn't exist on paper beyond that one drawing. And yet, that's exactly where Lowell had been looking. In his notes, agents found a phrase that had seemed cryptic at the time. Empty rooms don't echo. Now, they understood. He had found the sealed chamber. He had seen its shape in the plans, hidden beneath legal jargon and engineering codes. It was more than a construction anomaly. It was a vault, a tomb, a container built to outlast memory. The place where someone or something was meant to be forgotten, and the closer they came to reopening it, the more they felt the pressure of a silence that had been engineered with purpose. Because buildings can be made to hide things. But blueprints, if you know where to look, don't lie. The envelope had been sealed so tightly that the edges cracked when agents finally opened it. Time had yellowed the paper and stiffened the glue, but the contents were intact, just a single folded sheet. No letterhead, no preamble. The ink was smudged in places, as if written in haste or with unsteady hands. But the layout was deliberate. It was a map, not of streets, but of ownership, power, hidden movement. Drawn by hand with sharp, angular strokes, the map resembled a crude web more than a geographical layout. Circles marked intersections of influence, city blocks, buildings, properties. Around each, names had been scrawled, half of them crossed out. Some were local businessmen, others vaguely familiar government officials, and at least one former judge. It wasn't clear whether the names marked allies or targets, but the lines connecting them were unmistakable. Solid black lines for financial links, dashed ones for shared board memberships. Dotted red lines, ominously, were labeled only as facilitators. At the center of the web was a square, marked Foundation, NE quadrant, underlined twice. Next to it, the year 1998. Lowell had written no legend, but the intent was obvious to anyone who had been following the case. He wasn't tracking people. He was mapping how they moved through the infrastructure, the companies, the permits, the layers of control that allowed them to operate in plain sight. He had outlined a shadow network woven through the legitimate skeleton of the city itself. What made it terrifying was not its size, but its subtlety. Every name, every location, was tied to a legal process. A grant approved, a contract signed, a development fast-tracked. Nothing overtly criminal. Just the invisible pressure of influence. In the top corner, a date was circled. May 23, 1998. The last day, Lowell was seen alive. Next to that, in the same pen but shakier, his writing less measured now. More cramped, he had written a phrase once, then again, then a third time across the bottom margin of the page. They're already inside. They're already inside. They're already inside. The repetition was unlike him. Lowell's notes, even under stress, were methodical, controlled. This was something else. Panic, maybe. Or revelation, as if he'd realized, too late, that the line he'd been following didn't end in a single source of corruption, but looped back into the very institutions that were supposed to protect him. Forensics found faint smudges on the paper residue from the same chemical compound used to clean firearms. His prints were the only ones on the document. That ruled out tampering, but what it couldn't explain was the growing sense among investigators that the map was never meant to be a solution. It was a warning, The names on the map included individuals who were still in office, still donating, still building. Some were even loosely connected to the investigation itself through funding, oversight, advisory positions, which meant Lowell had known. Before he vanished, he had figured out what many of them still refused to admit. This wasn't a conspiracy operating from the outside. It had been allowed to grow from within. And now, with the map laid bare on the table, with the writing of a dead man spelling it out in triplicate, the implications were unavoidable. Lowell hadn't been silenced because he was wrong. He had been silenced because he was right. The call came anonymously, routed through a bureau tip line not meant for internal affairs. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and distorted through software, an added layer of protection. Even though the caller never gave a name. A truth that, once spoken aloud, snapped the focus of the investigation inward. Lowell, they said, had been warned, not by a threat in a dark alley, not by a faceless figure lurking in his rearview mirror, but by his own supervisor. A man in a crisp suit behind a government desk, a man who spoke in procedural language and institutional ambiguity, whose voice rarely rose above room temperature. Months before Lowell disappeared, the caller claimed, he had been summoned to a closed-door meeting on the 6th floor of the field office. No record of the meeting existed, no calendar entry. But it happened. "You're stepping into other lanes," the supervisor reportedly said. "There are boundaries." Lowell asked which case he was interfering with. He was told it didn't matter. What mattered was the overlap. What mattered was not pushing any further. He didn't stop. So the warnings escalated. Another meeting. A memo never filed, but written. Language softened to appear benign, but the subtext was clear. "You've made your concerns known. Further investigation is outside the scope of your assignment." The final warning, according to the whistleblower, came just 2 weeks before he vanished. No threats, no raised voices, just a private conversation in the supervisor's office. And one sentence delivered with such precision that it stuck with Lowell, and evidently with the man who had overheard it through a slightly ajar door. "Keep walking down that path, and you'll disappear with it." The words weren't recorded. They were never entered into a report. But agents now reviewing internal logs noticed that shortly after that final meeting, Lowell's clearance credentials began to change. First subtly, then sharply. He was locked out of archival databases he'd used for years. His requests started bouncing. Background processes logged auto-denials under vague reasons, classification mismatch, clearance under review. And then, nothing. The man who had once roamed freely through years of court records, property archives, and sealed case files was suddenly locked out of his own case. The whistleblower didn't provide a name, but investigators narrowed it down. The supervisor in question had retired 6 months after Lowell's disappearance, citing family health concerns. Since then, he'd relocated to a private consultancy specializing in government risk mitigation. Attempts to reach him were denied. Officially, he declined comment. Unofficially, he hung up the moment Lowell's name was mentioned. Agents still working the reopened case now talk in hushed tones. Something shifted after that call. Not just in what they were uncovering, but in how they were watched. Phones clicked. Desks were searched. A request to transfer the investigation to D.C. was stalled with no explanation. Lowell hadn't stumbled into corruption. He had stumbled into complicity. The kind that lives behind credentials, behind clearance levels, behind the thin wall that separates protection from power. He wasn't just digging into the mob. He had touched something sacred, and the Bureau, at least some part of it, had tried to bury him before anyone else could hear what he had to say. Years had passed since anyone thought to ask about the blue van. At the time, it was easy to dismiss just another forgettable vehicle in a city constantly under construction. a town where unmarked vans were as common as neon signs. But when investigators began quietly revisiting the old neighborhood where Alan Lowell had lived in 1998, memories started surfacing, hesitant at first, then with surprising clarity. It had been parked just down the street, never closer than a few houses away, always facing the same direction. A nondescript late-model Chevy, dark blue, matte finish, no decals, no rust. The windows were tinted to the point of opacity, illegal in most states, but no one had called it in. It wasn't aggressive. It was still. That was what made it stand out. One neighbor, an elderly man named Corbin Deakins, remembered it well. Didn't move for days, not once, just sat there like it was waiting for something to happen. He said he thought about calling the police, but never did. There was something about the van's silence that made him hesitate. It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like surveillance. Another neighbor, Linda Ramos, recalled coming home late one night and seeing a shape behind the windshield. Not a face exactly, she said. Just the sense that someone was in there, watching. I waved. They didn't move. She paused, then added, "It never made a sound. Not once. No engine turning over. No doors. Like it was just placed there." The van disappeared the same night Lowell did. There was no record of it in any initial police or bureau reports, likely because no one thought to mention it until long after the trail had gone cold. But now, with new eyes and a clearer understanding of what Lowell had been chasing, the presence of that van took on a different weight. It wasn't surveillance in the official sense. No bureau vehicle matched its description. No field team was assigned to watch Lowell. His own access had already been quietly revoked. He wasn't under investigation. He was being watched. Agents began looking into DMV logs, traffic cameras, any registered vehicles matching the model and description. Nothing. Either the plates were stolen or fake, or the van was part of something that didn't require registration at all. A ghost vehicle. But the neighborhood sightings weren't isolated. A report surfaced from a gas station attendant 10 miles away, filed that same week in 2098. A blue van, windows blacked out, parked at the far end of the lot for nearly an hour. No one got out, no purchase made. When the manager approached, it drove off without headlights. Lowell had made enemies. But he'd also made someone nervous enough to post a watch outside his house for days. And whoever they were, they didn't want to be seen. They didn't knock, didn't threaten, just waited. The assumption now is chilling in its simplicity. They knew what he was onto, knew where he lived, knew that the walls were closing in. The van wasn't a warning, it was confirmation. An anchor, a fixed point from which everything could be monitored. And when the time came, when Lowell finally crossed whatever line they had drawn in silence, the van didn't just leave. It took him with it. Her name wasn't Lena Moreau anymore. That identity had died quietly in the spring of 1999, not long after Alan Lowell disappeared. She had no social media footprint, no credit history from the past 2 decades, and no driver's license until 2007. She lived in a modest stucco house on the outskirts of Yuma, Arizona, under the name Veronica Ellis, registered as a caregiver for the elderly. No criminal record, no flagged aliases. She was a ghost until someone recognized her face. It was a junior analyst in the Bureau's facial recognition team who caught the match. He was cross-referencing archived casino employee rosters with DMV photos from surrounding states, looking for any anomaly that might connect to Lowell's unsolved case. When her face came up, aged by 2 decades but unmistakably hers, the entire room froze. Agents were dispatched the same week. They found her folding laundry on the back patio, her dog asleep at her feet. She didn't run. She didn't panic. She looked up, met their eyes, and said, "I wondered how long it would take." In the interview room 2 days later, she sat across from the same agents who had now traced Lowell's final months in painful detail. Her voice was calm but tired, like someone who had rehearsed the story too many times in her own head but never dared speak it aloud. She confirmed everything, yes. She'd worked at the Crescent. Yes, she'd met Lowell. Yes, she'd told him something she wasn't supposed to. He was the first one who listened, she said. Not just listened, he believed me. That's why they came after him. In early 1998, she'd been serving drinks in the lounge, quietly watching the backroom dealings she wasn't meant to see. Bags exchanged. Keys slipped under napkins. Names whispered in corners. One night, she overheard two men discussing a payout tied to property zoning approvals. A transaction connected to a shell company she later recognized on one of Lowell's printouts. She told him everything over coffee in a diner off Sahara Avenue. She remembered how he didn't interrupt once, just took notes, asked questions, then told her firmly that she needed to be careful. A month later, she found a note taped to her apartment door. No name. Just 5 words. Handwritten in capital letters. Leave, or you're next. The next morning, Lowell found her in her car, shaken and half-packed. He told her he could arrange a way out, a friend in Arizona, a new name, cash. No bureau paperwork, no trace. She said he was tense that day, different. Kept checking his phone, kept looking over his shoulder, like he knew something was closing in. I asked him what was happening, she said. He just said, "There's more than one trap here. I just didn't see mine in time." She disappeared the next day. Never saw him again. But a week later, before she changed her number for good, she got one last voicemail. Static heavy. Half a message. Just 6 words she never forgot. "Don't come back. They're inside." She deleted the message, burned the note, and vanished. For 26 years, she lived in the quietest corners of the desert, waiting for someone to ask why. Now they had. And with that answer, one thing was finally clear. Lowell hadn't just been chasing corruption. He was trying to save someone from it. And they made sure he never got the chance to finish what he started. The document wasn't filed under anything suspicious. Just a dry legal title in a beige folder labeled Deferred Adjudication. Agreement November 1997. It had sat untouched for over 2 decades in an off-site federal records archive, buried among thousands of similar files, all scanned and logged under case numbers no longer in circulation. It wasn't the kind of thing anyone would notice unless they were looking for it. When the team finally obtained a scanned copy, the language was precise and antiseptic. The subject: a mid-level organized crime associate facing a stack of charges related to racketeering, fraud, and money laundering. The outcome: all charges quietly dismissed in exchange for cooperation and testimony in future cases. But no testimony ever followed. The man disappeared 6 weeks later, off the grid. No transcript, no closed-door session, just gone. What stood out most wasn't the subject. It was the signatories. One was a federal prosecutor out of the Las Vegas district office. The other, oddly, was not an official party in the case at all. A real estate developer named Martin Kincaid, a name that had shown up repeatedly in Alan Lowell's notes. Kincaid wasn't under investigation. He wasn't mentioned in the charges. Yet there his signature was, on an addendum to the agreement, as a financial intermediary, ensuring fulfillment of negotiated terms. That phrase alone set off alarms. Further digging revealed that just 1 month after the deal was signed, Kincaid's holding company acquired the property rights to a 6-block stretch of downtown Las Vegas, including the lot where the Crescent Casino would be built. The purchase price? Just over $2 million, suspiciously low for such a valuable corridor of land. Even then, the seller, a different LLC linked to the same man who had disappeared after the plea bargain. The dots began to connect. That 1,997 agreement wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a cover. The charges were dropped in exchange for silence. But that silence came with a price. The turnover of key land, the erasure of testimony, and the foundation of a casino whose existence depended entirely on nobody asking the wrong questions. Lowell had found the edges of that deal. In his notes, buried under layers of coded shorthand, were references to exchanged silence, missing cooperation logs, and external non-signatory embedded. He had seen the shape of it before anyone else. But he never got the full picture because that picture wasn't supposed to exist. The prosecutors involved were promoted. Kincaid tripled his net worth by 2005, retired by 2008, and now lived abroad. The LLC that handled the property transaction dissolved before the ink was dry, and the federal office that approved the agreement claimed no memory of the case at all. Agents now understood. The Crescent wasn't built on a business model. It was built on a transaction, one that required the destruction of records, the relocation of witnesses, and the quiet disappearance of anyone who got too close. Lowell wasn't a casualty of chance. He was collateral damage in a deal so calculated, so deeply embedded in the city's infrastructure, that it had become indistinguishable from the progress it claimed to represent. What had looked like ambition on paper was, in fact, a burial. Concrete poured over silence, and Alan Lowell was beneath it. The day the indictments were unsealed, a cold wind cut across Las Vegas, even as the sun beat down on the Strip. Headlines broke across every major outlet within the hour. Casino empire, linked to federal corruption. FBI reopens 1,998 agent disappearance. And finally, justice for Alan Lowell. Inside the Bureau's Las Vegas field office, agents stood in silent awe as the names rolled across the screen. Former prosecutors, developers, and financial intermediaries. Some were retired. Some were still active. A few had long believed they were untouchable. But the truth, long buried, had cracked its way back into the light. The evidence found in the lockbox. The tape. The maps. The testimonies. The void beneath the casino floor. Each piece had fit together with mechanical precision. Together, they formed a narrative too solid to ignore, too damning to dismiss. The sealed room beneath the casino had been real. The permits were fraudulent. The 1,997 plea deal was a covert handshake masked by bureaucracy. And the blue van hadn't just been surveillance, it had been transport. Final. Silent. Erasing. Alan Lowell had seen it all coming, and he'd known he might not survive. The casino was shut down within days. Federal agents swept in at dawn, clearing the gaming floor before the morning rush. Patrons, employees, and executives were ushered out as warrants were served and records seized. Within a week, the building's operating license was revoked. The Crescent, once a symbol of opulence and power, stood dark and abandoned, the neon flickering like a dying heartbeat. At the Bureau, a ceremony was held. No cameras. Just the people who knew what it meant. Lowell was declared killed in the line of duty. Posthumously awarded the FBI Medal for Meritorious Achievement. His name was etched into the wall at Quantico, alongside other agents who'd fallen in pursuit of justice. But unlike most, Lowell had never fired his weapon in his final act. He hadn't died in a gunfight or explosion. He died digging, asking, refusing to look the other way. The photograph of him used at the ceremony wasn't one from a press file or case folder. It was one recovered from his home. Taken at a friend's barbecue, he wasn't in uniform, wasn't giving a speech. He was laughing, eyes bright, notebook tucked under one arm, like he never really stopped working. Even then, the woman he tried to save, Veronica Ellis, once Lena Moreau, attended in the back row, sunglasses shielding her face. She left before the ceremony ended. No one stopped her. She had said all she needed to, and that tape, the voice Lowell left behind, crackling through time, was now archived in the Bureau's digital records, unredacted. In training rooms across the country, new recruits would hear it, not as a lesson in fear, but in resilience. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous truth is the one hidden in plain sight, and the people brave enough to speak it often do so, knowing they may never be heard. Until someone listens. Lowell's legacy wasn't just in the justice that followed. It was in the trail he left for others to find. Quiet, methodical, human. He died not because he made a mistake, but because he refused to stay silent in a world that demanded his silence. And now, long after his voice was buried beneath concrete and time, it was finally heard. And it was louder than ever.